Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Bright Blue event in partnership with Unions 21. So Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. Unions 21 is a forum for trade unions to come together and discuss the future of the trade union movement and how they can be relevant in the 21st century. So the title of this morning's panel is The Changing World of Work. We've got a wide brief and a very wide-ranging expertise on the panel, so it's going to be an interesting morning. Please do tweet about the session. Our handle is @WeAreBrightBlue and Unions21 are @Unions21. So I'm Diane Banks. I'm a non-executive director of Bright Blue. In my day job, I'm CEO of North Bank Talent Management, and we represent authors and creators and speakers. So I have an involvement in my day job in the changing world of work. And I'm joined this morning by Jonathan Gullis, who is on the far right end here. So Jonathan is the MP for Stoke-on-Trent North. He's a member of the Petitions Committee and a former member of the Education Committee. And I would say Jonathan unfortunately has to leave us at 11 o'clock, I think. So I'm going to let him speak first this morning. And then on my far left, we have David Hale, and David is Head of Public Affairs at the Federation of Small Business. To my immediate right, we have Mike Clancy. Mike's General Secretary of Prospect. Many of you will know that Prospect is the trade union for engineers, scientists, managers and specialists in areas as diverse as agriculture, defence, energy, environment, heritage, shipbuilding, telecoms and IT and transport.
Just a bit.
And to my immediate left is Paul Fleming. Paul is General Secretary of Equity. Many of you will know what that is. So Equity is the trade union for creative practitioners, the most glamorous trade union, I think, generally known as. And then we have Jimmy McLoughlin. So Jimmy is the former business director for number 10 Downing Street, and prior to this, he was head of external affairs at the Institute of Directors, and he now hosts the brilliant podcast, Jimmy's Jobs of the Future, which I highly recommend you look up. Okay, so the format this morning is we've asked each of our panellists to speak for 5 minutes, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So just a few notes on the Q&A. If you're in the room, please could you wait? We have a roving mic, so please could you wait for the mic before you speak, because that's the way that it's going to be picked up on the live stream so that everybody can hear. If you would like to ask a question online, you're using Slido, and the code is BrightBlue5, and I believe there's a link there that you can click to get through to the questions. Right, so a lot of topics to cover this morning. Panellists can cover all of them, but if they do so, they have to do so in 5 minutes or pick out one or two of them. So we have the pandemic, work in the post-COVID world, Generation COVID has come to be known. How will they be affected by the employment market? We've got automation in employment. We've got digitalisation, particularly relating to trade unions. The role of the self-employed. I'm sure Paul's going to have a lot to say about that in particular. And do we need new rights for workers? Are there new kinds of rights we should be looking to implement in the workplace? Okay, so Jonathan, I'm going to start with you because you have to go. So you have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you very much to Bright Blue for the opportunity, and thank you to all of you who've turned up. I'm always amazed when it's not just me and one other in the room. So I'm delighted to have the chance to speak. And before entering POM, I worked as a secondary school teacher for 8.5 years, both in Birmingham and in London, and was the trade union representative for that one of my last 3 years of the school for NASUWT. However, looking across at this panel, I don't think I'll be a loss when I disappear at 11 o'clock, because you've got far more qualified people than me. But what I can say is that I think the pandemic has clearly made a change to the way that people work and the working patterns. But I think that in places like Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kidsgrove and Torquay, I'm proud to represent, there was already a certain challenge that laid ahead for us, particularly when it came to automation in the industry. For example, Stoke-on-Trent, I'm hopefully you'll know, is the ceramics manufacturing heart of the world. We used to employ tens of thousands, now we're employing thousands of people, and ultimately, as time goes on, that industry is going to find technological solutions in terms of making the product at a quicker pace to the same standard using machinery. And I see that at Churchill China, they're investing heavily in the technology of the future, and that's the right thing to do because it's the right thing for that business in order to thrive. But what has Churchill China done that's so smart? What they're doing is they're making sure their employees understand the machinery and the process. If you go into the room, the staff room, which has a wall about the size of that at the back of the hall, they have the entire layout of the factory and the machines that take part, the whole process that goes through on the back of the wall. And they ask their staff to look at it in their lunch breaks and figure out how to problem solve it, how to improve it. They've used a lot of Japanese techniques. So even though they may not be getting a formal qualification, they're making their staff part of the way of finding a solution to the problems, which I think is a really, really fascinating way of working, something that I'm incredibly impressed by. But look, if you look at why, for example, the potteries industry died in Stoke, is ultimately because businesses did not make that move towards automation. They tried to continue, obviously, with high price margins when you're employing people, paying national insurance and pensions on top. And so sadly, that industry got impacted because when it's competing with China, when it's competing with Turkey, where, let's be quite frank, there's nowhere near the same standards of workers' rights or health and safety practices we have in this country, then reality has to set in. But what's the future? Well, I've come up with a thing called Silicon Stoke, which I have shamelessly stolen from Leamington Spa because I grew up just outside of that. Silicon Stoke is based on the fact that we've just invested £9.2 million into Gigabit. By the way, that was government money, and we actually came under budget, which is a £600,000 under budget, which I don't think you get to boast about very often. But that was done with VX Fibre, a Swedish firm, Stoke-on-Trent City Council. That means we're now one of the leading gigabit cities in the country. We have Staffordshire University, which is the leading video games university in the country. 2,000 graduates currently going through their system, esports degrees. And I have an ambition to try and create an indoor arena, which will be an esports specialism, which Staffordshire University is supporting. And I hope that companies like Bet365, which is our largest private sector employer in the city, will get behind. Because if we can become the heart of the video games industry, which ultimately, let's not forget, was one of the only industries during the pandemic to actually continue growing, and obviously is a digital future, and we have the university already producing the skills, but we're not keeping those skills in Stoke, so the brain drain that's happening on Stoke is causing us a lot of damage. And if we can bring those type of industries, small clusters, maybe around one big employer, I think a digital future for Stoke is very, very important. Ultimately gives those skills for the people of the future. And I suppose it goes back into that automation process, ultimately, at the end of the day, that what we want is people to be digitally skilled and enabled, because they're the ones that, whilst robots and machineries are lovely, they are always going to need humans to help program them, control them, maintenance that comes with that as well. And so if we can get people in a position where they do that, then we're in a very strong place. Generation COVID, sorry, because I want to make sure I try and hit as much as I can. Generation COVID, for me, look, I'm biased, I'm a former teacher, so I look at young people in particular. And there's a real issue there. My brother-in-law was due to sit his GCSEs in the spring of 2020. Now, he wasn't destined for grade 9s, grade 8s, but he was a hard-working lad who really knuckled down and tried to do all he could. And what happened was the opportunity to achieve and have some self-worth was stolen from him when the exams were cancelled. Whilst he's got his passes and he's delighted with that, he never got the chance to earn it to prove that he was worthy of those grades. And now he's competing against others in the job market who are ultimately given grades he probably wouldn't have achieved the same as he did, because ultimately they wouldn't have put the same level maybe of effort in. And so I think Generation COVID is therefore a group of young people who have lost a sense of self-worth, a loss of identity, and a loss of get up and go, because ultimately we've shut down universities where they were doing everything online, and lots of universities now continuing that trend, which I think is the wrong approach. There's obviously that fear that as we go into the winter, schools could potentially end up getting shut down against part of Plan B with the COVID regulations. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but what I am pleased, and what I think you'll hear from the Chancellor today, is a continued investment. Kickstart, it seems, is going to be continuing the 3,000 for apprenticeships. If for an employer, contribution is going to continue as well. So there's going to be a real investment into young people announced today in the Chancellor's speech. So please make sure you get to the main stage and main auditorium and hear what is said there. And then very finally, what can employers do? I think employers can do a lot more. I think employers do good stuff, but I think employers have a social responsibility to their workforce. Stoke-on-Trent has 12% of the workforce that have no qualifications. Our national average is 4%. So that's a very scary statistic, because ultimately those are the people, when COVID hits, it's going to be the ones who are going to become long-term unemployed. So what should I want to see employers doing? Entering their workforce into that lifetime skills guarantee that was offered. So if you haven't got a level 3, get them enrolled and make that part of the process. Offer degree apprenticeships or apprenticeships within your workspace as well. Because ultimately for somewhere in Stoke, young people are going to want to earn and learn because they need the money. We earn £100 less per week than average across the UK in Stoke-on-Trent. So that having that financial support is so important as well. So I think if we can get employers and encourage them through things like Kickstart, through the apprenticeship funding as well, the apprenticeship levy actually working for business. It doesn't work for business at the moment. There's about 300 million, I think, sitting in the pot unspent, which is absolute insanity. And believe me, Treasury are going to look at that and think, oh, that would be, in a time of financial difficulty, let's claw that back in. So I do hope that we can see the apprenticeship levy tweaked and working for the interest of the employer. And that means, for me, the HR side, because a lot of you probably work for SMEs, you may have your own businesses. If you're working in an SME, you haven't got the time to be your own HR manager and do all the forms that come with an apprentice, as well as doing the actual day job and securing client contracts. I think colleges should be picking up the HR element of it, and they're taking that burden off the employers. The employer can focus on what they do best, imparting knowledge, imparting skills to make sure that young person or that adult is prepared for the future. Because clearly, not only we've got the challenge with young people, but the 50 to 64-year-old market was the second most affected in this pandemic. They are going to need reskilling and retraining potentially, and they're going to need that, I call it the grandmother effect. And I don't mean that to be patronising in the sense of putting the arm around the shoulder and encouraging them and making sure they feel supported and secured, because they may be going to an industry that they've only ever been. If you're in Stoke, you've probably worked in the pot banks your entire life. This will be the first time you're moving out of that system. So they've got to have that security that this is something that's safe, this is something that's long term, and it's something that, based on their age, won't be discriminated against. And we need to make sure that employers don't just focus on the youth, but they also remember those 50 to 60-year-olds need that support as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was fascinating about esports. I think in terms of the digital space, gamification, it's not just about playing games anymore. It's coming into absolutely everything. And of course, Stoke has a great tradition of entrepreneurship. I see Tristram Hunt is pushing Wedgwood as the original Steve Jobs in his new biography that's just come out. Okay, I'm going to go to the other end of the table to David now.
Great. Thanks ever so much for having me, and thanks very much for coming, everyone. I guess just to pick up at the end of that, really, and Generation COVID, firstly, I think, there's several Generation COVIDs. There's the young people coming out of school, but there's also the older workers that I think we're going to see increasingly take the brunt of what has happened over the last 18 months, and probably more and more of them choose to leave the labour market. So I think, what happens to young people is really important, but we do need to keep an eye, and more of an eye than has been in the last 18 months, on what happens to older workers. I think, in terms of young people, I think the policy response is broadly the right one. Kickstart is a very good scheme because it provides that 6-month block of work experience where people learn work skills that other people take for granted, where they can sit next to colleagues who can help them with their CV. A lot of this stuff doesn't need to be formal training courses. It can just be, who do you meet in the workplace? What do you talk to them about? What do you learn casually as a young person? So I think the Kickstart element of the policy response is really good. Furloughs obviously helps a lot of people. I think, as ever, we have a problem in the UK with vocational training not taking the same priority as academic training. We always talk about it. We've talked about it at every one of these conferences I've ever been to, but we look at the HGV example right now. In the pandemic, academic courses where you needed to be there in person were prioritised to continue. HGV driving, even driving, so young people can learn to drive, which is important for roles, wasn't until quite late, wasn't until November last year that was sort of included in the exceptions. And I think that's just a good example of where vocational training in practice, no matter how much we talk about it and how hard we try, always goes to the bottom of the list whenever something happens. So I think that's important. I guess the final thing on Generation COVID and the employment impact of the pandemic is, some of Generation COVID will be fine and will do well and will be good, and some people will do less well, and the people that will do less well are the people that were doing less well before the crisis. There'll be disabled people, people with health conditions. That was half of the people who are unemployed at the start of the crisis. I think there are problems with how some of the support works and some of the detail of it. You can't get on Kickstart if you're on the work and health program, but Kickstart would be a great start for a young disabled person. And I think it's just about focusing really hard on those groups that most need support. The shape of the support has been developed in an emergency and developed very well. It is blocks of work experience, it is giving people training, it is getting more people trained on HGV or whatever vocational courses we demand. It just takes quite a lot of focus, I think, to actually, when these issues come up, to make sure that we're kind of living what we say. So that's the main thing I'd say on Generation COVID. I think just briefly, in terms of wider automation, I'm not a pessimist about it. I think it's a positive thing. It's a good thing for the economy. The challenge is just running to keep up with it. I don't think that's impossible. I think it again has challenges for older workers as well as younger workers, but it is achievable. I think self-employment has the capacity to actually bend quicker with changing markets and with changing ways of working. So I think it is really just how do we go with the flow and thrive off it rather than fearing automation for its own sake.
And in terms of small businesses specifically, I mean, I'm imagining that a lot of your members have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, more so than big business. But then on the other side of the coin, I'm imagining there are now opportunities for people to start new businesses. Would that be fair to say?
I mean, there are opportunities for people to start new businesses, and people are doing that, and that has always been a big part of the reaction to unemployment and to recession, and it should be. Coming out of the last recession, about a third of the people who were out of work that came into work through setting up their own business and being self-employed.
Interesting.
I would love to see that happen again. I think that would be really important. I would love, but did not necessarily expect the Chancellor to call on the stage today for everyone in the country to go out and start their own business if it's something they want to do, whether they're in work or not. I think it is a shame that things like the new enterprise allowance, which perform much better than the work programme in terms of getting people off benefits, that the reports are that that's going to go. I think that is a shame. I think it would be nice in whatever form it came, whether it was more startup loans, whether it was simply talking about it more. I think it would be nice for people to give a strong conference message that starting business is something that we will back on, and those groups that do get the exaggerated impacts of any problems in the labour market, like disabled people, like people with health conditions, much more likely to get into work, even compared to the population as a whole, if they start their own business and if we support them in doing so.
Thank you, David. Go to Mike now.
Thank you. So that long list of membership groups that we represent in Prospect, I'll just add one more to it, which is the creative sector alongside Paul, where we, if you can imagine the end credits of most film and TV, I can talk to you with some expertise now in what a best boy gaffer and grip is. But these are key people who create this content and the great success that we have in our creative industries. And Prospect's also politically non-affiliated, and I think sometimes it's forgotten that trade union membership is a broad church, and we survey our members. Jonathan's own experience as a representative is illustrative of that, and we know regularly that around about 30% of our members vote Conservative. And therefore we come to it as a trade union with a pragmatic approach to the workplace. We obviously have our views on equality, fairness, and what we want to see in the future of work. But we'll work with anybody. We'll probably also fall out with anybody as well. So we can do both of those things in equal measure.
Keep an eye out.
But what I think, I'll just frame my comments quickly with the reference back to around about April of 2020, when I met more government ministers in 30 days than I had done in 30 years. And what we actually did was to co-create many of the things which helped civic society get through the pandemic. Not least the furlough scheme, the SAYS scheme, the self-employment scheme, to the extent that it was sufficient. I'll say something about that in a moment. But what it demonstrated that when we were actually faced with something which had an overarching impact on all of us, we were capable of putting down ideology, we were capable of putting down orthodoxy, and we were capable of coming up with pragmatic solutions which help people in the workplace. And I think it's important we don't lose that now. If we're going to build back better, it's going to be necessary. And if I may say so, if there is a genuine objective of a high-wage, high-skill economy, and that's the objective of, say, the Conservative Party, you won't do it from where you are now. You won't do it without trade unions being part of the solution, part of the constructive challenge. And we have dismantled a lot of the spaces in which we convene each other over 30 years or more. And I think government does have a role to convene and ensure that there's worker voice. And unions will also have to be prepared to embrace much more flexibly a whole range of challenges. But worker voice, collective bargaining is going to be part of the solution to wage rates, and that is unavoidable. In terms of what we've seen in the last 18 months or so, I'll cover three things: flexibility, technology, and the structure of the labour market. Look, there's a vital conversation to be had about flexibility. I think we've got to be careful that we don't just talk about working from home as the only element of flexibility, because actually many people do not have access to that as an opportunity. Yes, that has its benefits, and I'm sure will feature as part of a whole range of employers' messaging and working practices in the future. But I think we've got to be careful that there isn't a public and private sector divide on that. Most of our members operate in the private sector, so we're used to the challenges of competitive pressures and how businesses have to adapt to changing product markets and technology. So it's important that we don't have unequal opportunity as a result of the debate about flexibility at work. And we've definitely got evidence that whilst working from home and some of the changes we've seen in the last year has helped people manage their caring responsibilities and other features of their domestic life, there's also been a challenge in lengthening working days. Our research is maybe about an hour or more on people's days, which is why we've started the campaign about the right to disconnect. And whilst we might talk about that in legislative terms, in reality, we need to bring employers, governments and trade unions together to talk about this and get the right tailored arrangements for the workspaces that they're in. In terms of technology, look, we've all now know what Zoom, Teams are and grapple with it and enjoy it to different extents. Hybrid meetings are an interesting challenge to manage, but nonetheless, it's going to be part of our future. What I think we haven't probably thought through yet is the question of what working from home durably looks like when it's a fixed part of our arrangements. And employers' responsibilities in terms of safety, for example, we represent the Health and Safety Inspectorate, do not end at the workplace. They're now in people's homes. So there are questions of privacy, there are questions of boundary, but there are also going to be questions of surveillance. And our research suggests that 1 in 4 of home workers are now being monitored. And depending on your value set and how far you see personal liberty and freedom and privacy is important, these are going to be real issues. And they come down to the question of trust in terms of how employers are going to be deploying people. And then the question of the structure of the labour market. Paul will say more on self-employment, but we represent about 20,000 freelancers. The creative industries have always been a strong user of that sort of labour, given the episodic nature of productions and so on. What I think the last 18 months has done, though, is led some people to question whether they continue to want to work in freelance occupations. The self-employed scheme helped a lot of people, but it also excluded a lot of people. And that is one of our ongoing complaints in that respect. However, what I think we have to get back to is a proper focus on the difference between bogus self-employment, where there is genuine exploitation, and where self-employment is an engine of entrepreneurial contribution in the economy, where it works for both the individual and the engager. But I think we have to look at a new deal here and ask ourselves some questions about the right balance of employment rights and regulation, and this links to the tax system as well. And we've done some detailed work on this, and I think there are really some complex issues. So when we have good engagement with Minister Scully on a range of these matters, he's a small business minister, met Paul in person, with Tom, my colleague, last week or so, and that was good to do. How do we engage in this future? What will the next employment bill look like? And the thorny issue of employment status, tax alignment will need to be delivered so that we do have an opportunity to give freelancers, the self-employed, the confidence to continue in those forms of employment in the future.
Thank you. That's interesting to hear how, I mean, obviously you were speaking to government more closely during the crisis than perhaps you would ordinarily be. Do you think that the government is drawing more on trade unions for advice on these topics during this crisis than it would have been, say, I don't know, during the financial crisis or the Second World War? Do you think there's more of a kind of intermeshed relationship there?
I think it varies. We had the sites at the 5 o'clock conference, remember those, where unions were referenced by government ministers. And let's be honest, we may not, in the public's eye, have been seen as natural bedfellows in the past. But when there was an overarching crisis and we needed to do some extraordinary things, everybody realised that particular political lines were not relevant. It's that pragmatism, I think, we need to find.
Yes.
And I do strongly evangelise for the point that a lot of the labour market challenges will need worker voice. Unions are a key component in that. And we can agree on many things, and we can put our disagreements in certain compartmentalised box and work them through. So I'm crucially for actually trying to find some solutions and talking it through based on evidence and measure.
Dan, sorry, very quickly before because I know it's odd for a Conservative to sort of be pro the union message, but I really am, because I think if you look at Stoke, a very heavy unionised city when the pot banks were at their highest. What's happened to the unions, obviously, as the pot banks have reduced in number, therefore the unionisation of the city's died with it. And actually what's happened is there's been a massive shift, and Mike, is bang on the money, that, a lot of members are no longer just, I'm a trade union member, therefore I must vote Labour. They are, the voting public now is much more than natural floating voter. And I personally think trade unions are a fantastic thing. When I was there, I like to think I worked with my management at my school. I worked with the management of my trust. I'd actually balloted to strike against my multi-academy trust, which is an odd thing for a Conservative to do. But ultimately, I think that trade unions are absolutely a really keenness. I think we saw the very best of the trade union movement in some quarters, particularly in the business sector. I also think we saw, pardon me, lose my voice. I also think we saw some of the worst when it came to the education, where I feel that there was a self-interest agenda being pushed over the interests of the children, the teachers, because when I spoke to teachers, for example, they had a very different opinion to those of the trade union voices. So I think that what we're hearing here from Mike is bang on. If we're going to have this serious conversation about what working from home actually means, if we're going to have this serious discussion about flexible working, if we're going to be starting to talk about how to deal with the digital world and what that means, obviously, for workers and their ability to switch off and not feel pressure to work till midnight, has to have the trade unions with them. And I think then we'll see the trade unions come back into a real strength and on positive light within the public's perception, personally.
Yeah, that's great insight into how the role's changing. Jonathan, do you have to...
I have to go, unfortunately. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to Jimmy next. You had some interesting people on your podcast recently, Jimmy.
Yes, I have, and I guess one of the themes of the podcast is that every 30 or 40 years, the kind of British state goes through a pretty major shift, and you can trace it back to the start of the 20th century, foundation of the Labour Party, unions, etc. World War II, Attlee and the foundation of the welfare state, 1970s, 80s, rolling back of the state, Margaret Thatcher, etc. When I was in Downing Street between 2016 and 2019, I always thought that Brexit was going to be the thing that led to the kind of next reformulation of it, and it was obviously with the pandemic, it has even accelerated that even further, and that provides enormous kind of challenges for what happens now in terms of how we remould the state and make it more effective for people. It is almost the equivalent that we sort of seem to be living through, almost like a modern day renaissance. If you look at the way that those things in the Renaissance happened in terms of migration kind of flows, and also communication was a big part of the Renaissance, that we're effectively having that again now, and the parallels are amazing. And if you look at it, what happened during the Renaissance, everyone was better off at the end of it, but going through it was a huge challenge, and lots of people weren't necessarily positively impacted by it. And so that is a huge challenge for whoever is in power to kind of deal with that. In terms of kind of generation COVID and so on, I think it is an enormous challenge. I think for my own generation as well, that we've had sort of 3 shock events since my graduation just 13 years ago, in terms of the financial crash, the Brexit vote, and the coronavirus pandemic. That is, that I think builds more resilience than perhaps that we give young people credit for sometimes. And whilst it's easy to write things about Generation Snowflake, etc., actually I think they're a lot more resilient than we give credit for. In terms of my own story, I definitely was kind of impacted by it. So I left Number 10 2 years ago to start a family, and after went out to study at Stanford, got back, and the pandemic hit, and my wife ended up going back to work as an NHS doctor, and I became a stay-at-home dad. So I'd gone from Downing Street to diapers within the space of 6 months, and that was, I can assure you, not what the plan entailed. But I think it demonstrates how that working day is changing. And now, actually, the way that I structure it, for example, is that I used to be an early mornings person. I used to be in Downing Street at kind of 7 a.m. in the morning, etc. Now I don't start the working day till much later because that's when my daughter is in the best mood of the day and so on. So actually, we take her to nursery later. And that's an amazing shift that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago. So I feel like it's positively benefits to people, but I am also aware that I'm at the position where I can choose things. When you're part of the generation that is learning and trying to build these networks and support systems for you, it's incredibly difficult. And I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to automation. Is we've had some great guests on the podcast, like you say, Ben Francis from Gymshark is kind of like the outstanding one. If you want to check out one episode, I would please you to check out that one. Jimmy's Jobs of the Future, by the way, quick plug again. See how many times I can get it in 5 minutes. But is essentially a lot of the jobs are similar to what the aims were in terms of business. The aims have always been to kind of, make money and so forth. And all of that remains the same. But what is different now is the tools that people are using to be able to do this. And the tools are updating so enormously quickly that it is difficult for people to keep up with it. But actually, I think Generation COVID, and I think it's probably really bad that we term them like that, actually, have already fallen into that trap. But they'll be more resilient and be able to get hold of these tools much quicker than probably most of us in this room looking around us. And so I think that's an amazing opportunity. And when you look at the Gymshark story and so forth, they built it off social media influencers, which sometimes we sort of dismiss a little bit, kind of in Westminster, Whitehall, policy making and so on. But what these people are doing, is quite extraordinary in terms of the followings that they're building. And actually, the content and the creation of this, as Mike was talking about, has got to be good, because otherwise people don't engage with it. And actually, I think in the UK, once again, we're kind of leading the world in a lot of this stuff, and that is really encouraging. So overall, I think that we should be really optimistic. But it is just a challenge, because the career ladder doesn't really exist anymore. We do live in the age of squiggly careers, and that can be very difficult to work out how to navigate at points. And that's what we're trying to do with the podcast, is interview entrepreneurs that are creating jobs and creating jobs in new, exciting sectors where people want to work. So overall, I'm really optimistic about it, but understanding that information and the tools are probably some of the skills that have become more important than ever before.
I think the comparison with the Renaissance is really interesting, particularly when we think that, of course, possibly the greatest technological disruption of all time was the invention of the printing press, and that had massive implications about the manuscript creators in Renaissance Florence, etc. Okay, right, and last step, going to Paul.
Thanks very much. So as I said before, I'm Paul Fleming, I'm the General Secretary of Equity, most famously the union for actors, but we also represent directors, designers, choreographers, burlesque performers, clowns, fire eaters, children's entertainers, the works. And we have about 47,500 members, and they are trades unionists. They are some of the oddest trades unionists you might possibly think of. 90% of British drama on TV is made on a trade union collective agreement. Every West End show is made on a trade union collective agreement. The vast majority of touring theatre, of Arts Council funded theatre, of local authority funded theatre up and down the country is on a trade union agreement. And our membership density compared to in the economy as a whole is around 80 to 90% in live performance and between 60 and 70% in recorded media. So it is very, very likely when you're sat down watching EastEnders that you're watching trades union members perform on TV, which is not necessarily the sorts of people we historically think of as trade union members, and they're young. There are more members of ours who are 28 years of age than any other. And there is a great enthusiasm to come and join a trade union and be part of something which genuinely gives you a say over your working life. We experienced 15 years of continuous growth as a union, and notwithstanding a small blip because of this pandemic malarkey, we've grown consistently over the last 5 months as well, which I think tells a story about where dynamic trade unions in growing sectors of the economy, in modern forms of work, are headed. And when I talk about trade unions in general and what our purpose is, the function of every trade union is to ensure that a working person can flourish as an artist. That is the core function of any trade union, whatever industry you're organising in. Our desire is that you get a better work-life balance, a better rate of pay, that we provide training, education, support, and we allow you actually to become more than a number, more than just somebody who exists within a workplace, but flourish as a human being, essentially become an artist. Our function is the same as that, but we also have another one, which is convincing artists that they're also working people and making sure that they fundamentally understand that they're out there making money for other people, and that is money that they deserve to share in. And I think that within that broad mission of our union, there is a lesson about where trade unions and indeed the future of work is headed. And on the broad question, what is the future of work after COVID? The answer is that the future of work for the economy looks like the history of work for Equity's members. So we've been around for 90 years, and those have been 90 years of our members being by and large self-employed, being in by and large precarious employment, by and large low-paid employment, but also by and large creative employment. Employment where actually our response to digitisation and automation is to do things like provide royalties and secondary payments when film and TV and radio develops. That is our response to automation. Our response to automation is to genuinely reward people for the intellectual property that they contribute to make sure that there is a fair balance. It is a future which is very precarious, but fundamentally it's underpinned by a very strong structure of collective bargaining. And actually, if we look at where we've been over the last 15 years with a growing sector, the average pay rise on our major theatre agreements has been between 60 and 70% over the last 15 years, which vastly outstrips the average in the rest of the economy. And that is a really, really, really important story about where we go. It is not a choice between being a ballet dancer or working in cyber. It is more about learning the lessons of how ballet dancers have got to where they are, and indeed the challenges that they have faced. Because it is not inevitable that we end up with low-paid, unpaid internships, which have existed in the arts for much longer than anywhere else. It's not the case that the self-employed are constantly excluded from the benefits of being in society, because actually what we've seen over the last 12 months is a rethinking, an imperfect rethinking, but a rethinking of what that really means, and about looking at the balance, if you like, between your role as a working person and your work-life balance and what people really want. Because that is one of the biggest challenges that we see across the economy and with workers at the moment. A lot of shortages are not driven necessarily by low pay. They're driven by unfair work-life balances. They're driven by deficiencies in other terms and conditions. They're driven by constantly being emailed when you're not at work, a blurring of a boundary between what a holiday is and what a holiday isn't. What is a weekend? When does my working day finish? That has been the negative side of the pandemic. And that whole is, again, something that our members have experienced for a very, very long time. They've never been paid for line learning. The consistent, our members on average who work as actors are experiencing around 15 auditions or job interviews a month, and probably getting about one every other month. That is an extraordinary gap and an extraordinary mental toll that it takes on you. And that is the experience of Generation COVID. That is the experience of people in every sector of the economy. As we are where we are, I think it is important to reflect on that question that's been asked about government engagement with trade unions, particularly over the last 12 months. And I think there's an awful lot to be said for how this government, through this pandemic, has at points engaged with trade unions as the people who are banks of an awful lot of expertise. And the example given about Stoke-on-Trent, you have entire workforces of management consultants who are there desperate to make their working lives easier and companies succeed, but if only they are asked what their opinion is. And it is very encouraging that the government has set up a series of trade union advisory groups around things like international trade, of which both myself and Mike are members, to have a genuine input in in the sense of the creative industries, a sector of the economy that's worth more to the UK economy than banking. So it is really, really encouraging that is where we're going. And I do think that if you look at probably the government's most successful response to the pandemic is the furlough scheme. It was something that was dreamt up in partnership with trade unions, in partnership with the TUC. That tells a positive story about where we all are. And there is a trend in trade union leadership to be deeply focused on issues in the workplace, to be deeply focused on that enormous imbalance which has occurred between employers and their workforces. That is something which I think is probably positive for an ongoing relationship of with governments of any persuasion, because actually it means that we can have a constructive conversation about terms, conditions and rights at work. And if there's a single appeal that I would make, again, in this particular forum, it's to use the conservative instinct to slash red tape in their approach to trade unions and collective bargaining. Actually, it is an area where the Conservative Party at points has appeared obsessed with continuing to put into place red tape and restrictions on trade unions continuing to bargain, whereas actually the truth is less restriction on trade unions and less of a focus on statutory rights leads to a more flexible economy, it leads to a more flexible approach to workplaces, it leads to a much more flexible approach to terms and conditions and even to tax, where our members are self-employed for purposes of tax and national insurance in the vast majority of instances where they work, but the vast majority of them are also workers or indeed in some instances employees with a specifically negotiated tax arrangement that arises from collective bargaining. That is a really positive story about workforce empowerment, a successful government engagement, and actually a lessening of red tape and letting workers do what they do best, which is support their workplaces and their industries. So, yeah.
Given the nature of your membership, would you say that a significant part of your time is spent in dealing with intellectual property rights issues?
It's probably one of the biggest issues that we face. A constant debate. I mean, a really good example of that, red tape versus, I'm going to use this expression, work tape versus worker power, is around equitable remuneration. There is a big demand to introduce statutory remuneration from musicians, where they are really suffering in the kind of dominance of Spotify, whereas actually for our members that doesn't really work. We're much happier with our strong collective agreements that we have, whether it be the BBC or independent TV producers, or indeed increasingly with things like audiobooks and so on, where we have bargained levels of secondary payment to come back. And there is that debate. I mean, I think our members are in an odd position. They are performers, there are performers' rights. It's not a clear cut, that they have the intellectual property or own it, but they do share in the ongoing, in a proportionate way, in the ongoing value of the products that they're part of. That is a question for lots of workers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that because I think as we move towards a more creative and IP-based economy, that's going to become more and more significant for all types of unions and representation, I would think. Okay, great. So we're going to move to questions. Just as a reminder, if you're in the room, please wait for the roving mic before you speak. And if you're online, then the code is brightblue5, and you can also click the link, which I think is in the Slido box. Just to explain that I'm having the online questions texted to me in case you wonder what I'm doing on my phone. Right, so we have a question here at the back of the room.
Did you say who they are?
Yes, if you could just say who you are.
Yeah, my name is Ishmael and I work for MainCap. So having a learning disability like myself, so when I was looking for work, I didn't get any support after I met MainCap. After 50 interviews that I went through before meeting with MainCap. So the MainCap Employment Service who supported in got me into work, and my main question is, what is the government plans to support people with a learning disability to find work and reasonable adjustments put and being made in a person's journey to find work?
Unfortunately, our MP has had to leave, but maybe Mike, could you make some suggestions as to what they might commend?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry to hear your experience, but I guess it's not in any way unusual for probably me and Paul to hear those sort of issues arise. That said, our experiences of sophisticated employers who, working with unions and others, would have the right sort of approach to the diversity of its workforce. I think for all of us, I mean, I've just signed off our equality, diversity and inclusion policy in the union. And the point I've made there is that that is a journey that never ends. And you have to be humble in the face of changing views in society. And you also have to be humble and know that your own organisation has to continue to walk the talk and deliver against whatever, say, legal regulation or other provisions might exist. So I think what you really have to find is within organisations and within government, a genuine commitment that we want a diverse workforce, that you have an underpinning legislation for those employers who find it difficult to accommodate those views or those challenges, which they can be sometimes. But essentially, we are committing as a society to being genuinely inclusive. Now, that's both a legal, an emotional, and a moral, and indeed a professional commitment. And that's really where we need to focus our attention, because sadly, some of your experiences are not unusual.
Did you want to add anything to that, Paul?
No, I think Mike's probably covered it, but I think, as David was saying in his talk, it is about making sure that if we have a genuine commitment to a diverse workforce, there's an awful lot of focus on people in work. There is very little focus on getting them into work in a diverse and inclusive way, and it is a big post-pandemic question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a question online now. It's an anonymous question, and the question is, how can trade unions adapt to organising within the fragmented workforces that come about as a result of becoming remote and or digital first? Of course, trade unions have their roots in organising, as we used to call it. I guess you guys again. Do you want to go first?
I suppose it is really interesting, and to emphasise the scale of the challenge, the difference between the levels of membership that we have in professions which have always been diverse, always been broken up, like theatre directors, designers, choreographers and so on, small-scale independent dancers, much lower than those conventional workplaces. I would call a conventional workplace a theatre, a film set, a TV studio. There are innovative ways to engage with people online, but simply it is an issues-based question. It is an issue. If people hear trades unions talking about the issues that they care about, and they genuinely feel the difference in their pockets, or indeed genuinely hear an aspiration to improve what's in their pockets and their work-life balance, then it does represent not only an improvement in our own memberships, but also an improvement in our ability to achieve those changes. The vast majority of equity members do not join through the workplace. They join online, outside of work, in order to be part of that movement. So I think it's about speaking very, very directly, very, very clearly, and not in a polemic way about how we improve.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's the idea that unions are, you join to be a part of something, which I guess if you're working in a more organised environment, that's not so important because you've already got your colleagues. Jimmy, did you have thoughts on that? I know you've done a lot around digitisation, digital world.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's really difficult. I mean, to Ishmael's question as well, just previously, I think one of the interesting things is it's really hard to assess your own skill set. Like, it's quite challenging to do that. And I can use me as an example. Coming out at number 10, I didn't know what I was going to do, and I couldn't really. It took me a long time to work it out, and it's just quite hard. And that's where I do think what the government has done around career coaches and work coaches is quite interesting. And it seemed that was an idea that a few years ago wasn't really that mainstream, and now actually we're seeing that executive kind of coaching much more available to lots more people, and I think that's broadly a good thing, because there's a huge underutilised talent pool that we have in the country that we're not using, and we need to be using it in a post-Brexit world much more clearly. I mean, there are 900,000 people that are ill at any given time. I do a bit of work with a charity called Astrid, which looks at placing those people into work that are long-term cancer sufferers, etc. Because it's so important. People need work, it's not just for a paycheck, it's for a camaraderie, it's for all those other things, a sense of purpose and all of that, and that is so important. And I think that we sometimes kind of forget that when in politics and so on we look at spreadsheets and numbers, particularly when you deal with the Treasury a lot, and actually it's some intangible things there that you can't put a value on.
Mike?
Well, look, a number of our members, a bit like Paul's in different ways, there is a compelling occupational reason to join which will endure. If you're an air traffic controller or if you're a power engineer on a transmission distribution system or in a power station, you join a trade union because there's a clear occupational reason. Every day you go to work because you're probably in a safety environment, you've got a set of responsibilities and you want to ensure you've got an advocate there in the event. And of course we collectively bargain their pay. So there's that segment of the workforce where people are doing things which will continue to be, I think, a fertile ground for trade unions. But you touched on a really important point, this. Most of the challenge for trade unions in getting people into membership is not that there's a philosophical objection, it's our ability to ask people to join. And that comes over time and again from surveys. Now, 85% of our members join online, and we have been investing heavily in our digital reach. Unions are going to continue to transform in that way. Personally, I think unions need to be less Fordist and rather more flexible in the offering that they make to members. We need to listen to non-members and members much more. And that will mean we have to think about their personas, what they're interested in, what speaks to them. Because we will see a diminution in our ability to have the water cooler moment if, say, 60% people more now are working from home in certain environments. So that will be a challenge that unions are really now starting to think about, and we are earnestly. It's our big exam question.
Absolutely. And David, I guess your members aren't typically members of unions.
Well, I guess we would probably say we are a trade union for employers, so
Yes.
and for the self-employed. So I guess, you know, similar. A lot of our members join because something that wouldn't be acceptable for most of the workforce is the larger businesses that they supply to don't pay them when they're supposed to, and they don't pay them for months, and they never get paid for work they've done and work they delivered. And you know, to the extent we can help with that, that's part of the reason people join, and similar things to that. So I think, you know, challenge for everyone to stay relevant. That's what we'll try to do, and I'm sure we're all in a similar aim on that.
And how do you think digitisation has changed your ability to organise your members?
I guess probably wouldn't necessarily say organise in quite the same way, but you know, small businesses increasingly do the largest part of their work online. We'll do more so. We will do the same. You know, I think it's positive. I think most small businesses are pretty optimistic about what the future can bring, or they probably wouldn't be in it. So I think we would share that view when it comes to technology.
Yeah. Okay, any more questions in the room? Yes, there's one here.
Thank you for a great discussion. I'm Anna Thomas, Director and Co-founder of the Institute for the Future of Work, set up in 2018 with a Nobelist, Chris Pisarades, and a technologist, Naomi Clymer. Much of what you've said has struck a real chord, especially what you've said about automation. We're at the moment trying to help reframe the automation debate, making sure that we're not stuck on job displacement, and we cover the range of impacts on work and the experience of work, which can be positive or negative, depending on the approach taken. With that in mind, I'm going to ask you, if I may, about the AI strategy, which is hot off the press. Do you agree with us that human-centred automation and AI is really important to shaping a better future of work, to maximising benefits and minimising risks? And secondly, how can we help the government and business focus more on human-centred AI and automation that puts people first, augments human skills, and is aimed at creating better jobs across the country?
That's a really great question. I mean, I always, personally, always take an optimistic view of AI and think that human skills, creativity, and the value of being human personalities, etc., is going to become even more valuable because other things can be automated. But I'd love to hear the views of the panel. Jimmy?
Yes. Well, I think one of the challenges around AI is probably actually what we need to be focusing on is augmented intelligence, right? Because it's a lot of the kind of 30-year scenarios are quite a long way off for some of these things in terms of where it's going to be on that. And I think we have an amazing opportunity when it comes to AI in the UK in terms of getting the regulation right, because we can be a world leader in it. And this is where I did a lot of technology work when I was in Number 10, and we're never going to be able to compete with the US's capital markets and the depth of them there. We're not going to be able to compete with China's size in terms of having a market size of 1 billion people. But actually, we can win on trust, and we are trusted by a lot of those players, and that's where the opportunity is for us with that. And so, I'm with you. I think it ultimately leads to better and more fulfilling jobs being created if we can automate some of the more duller tasks and so on. However, there is a challenge around this, that it does almost create more work as well, right? And so this is to the point I'm sure the trade unionists will agree with. So my example of AI would be when you would send an email to somebody and you would think, I used to do this at Number 10, I'm just going to send a quick one-liner to somebody about something. And then it says, oh, do you want to include this person in the email as well? And you think, yeah, I probably should actually include them. And then it's like you sort of end up including 5 or 6 people, and you end up starting a whole email chain that leads to an enormous amount of work sort of happening from that. And and I think that is the kind of challenge, of the kind of like right to disconnect and all of that, that it is a real thing, because there are amazing opportunities with these, but it is how we harness them. But it is a big play from the government in terms of we can be a world leader in AI. We have DeepMind here in the UK, which is genuinely a world leader in it.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I think with your broad number of sectors that you represent, I imagine you've got something to say on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was referring to before about government convening the different partners across workspaces. A number of other national jurisdictions do this so much better and have already created spaces based upon their national history of engagement to talk about, Industrial Revolution 4.0 or whatever it may be. And this is also with governments of the centre-right, particularly in Germany, for example, where there are very clear arrangements for engaging the social partners. And if we don't do this, then the opportunity of AI will become a dystopia. And it will magnify existing inequalities in the labour market. And discussions about flexibility and about opportunity that we've had earlier in this session will give way to the prior experience in the UK economy of industrial change being far from just. And trade unions. I grew up in Liverpool, and I experienced in the 80s and so on industrial change that wasn't just. And there is a significant role for government in this. To be clear with the major players, with trade unions and other social partners, what are we going to do about this? Because the one thing is clear, you have to embrace technology. And that's not always been easy for trade unions. There's plenty of union history of opposing technological insertion. It goes on all the time in the membership groups that I have the privilege to represent, and they adapt to it. The question is when you've got a gear shift in the economy in terms of technology. I think some of that might have actually been delayed in the last year because many businesses were operating on an emergency basis, month by month, getting through. From 2022 onwards, particularly as things start to settle down, business models, the actual cost base reveals itself much more, they'll reach back again to their technology programs, and I see a further acceleration of it. We need to be ready to adapt to that and have spaces in which we can talk to each other about it. And it won't be done company by company. If it is done company by company, it will be down the dystopia end of the scale rather than the opportunity and the engaged end.
Yeah. And David, you must have members who are startups in the AI space. You must see quite a lot of that.
Yeah, no, we do. And it's I think there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. Yeah, I mean, there will always be displacements to manage, but in terms of how we see it from that perspective, that's kind of new members coming to us, setting up very exciting businesses, doing very exciting things. I do think you've got to watch in terms of how you manage displacement from automation, because as it stands, the roles that are probably getting displaced are administrative roles, and the good and bad thing about that is when they go, when you follow people out of those roles, and what do they do? Some of those come and join us setting up brilliant startups, whether technology or otherwise, and some of those go into lower paid jobs, and it tends to split 50-50, but different countries do different things to manage the problem, and I think we can probably do better on that. But no, I think there's a lot of good things to come.
And Paul, your membership, being creatives, I imagine is the least likely to be affected by AI, but that might be a bit oversimplistic.
No, it's. I mean, it affects us in a very particular way, I suppose, and I think there's two themes. I forget how many years ago it was now, about 5 or 6 years ago. It was a Star Wars film where they essentially resurrected dead actors entirely through artificial intelligence. You had people returning back who had died, some during filming and some previously. That in and of itself had to be dealt with by the unions and by the producers through the collective bargaining process. And I think, although that's a very niche and a very peculiar thing that we are seeing increasingly, we have had to change our collective agreements to deal with that very, very odd, very, very high level AI. But what's the lesson for the rest of the economy? We were able to be flexible and do that and deliver fair remuneration to the estates of those people, because we have a strong collective bargaining framework.
Yeah.
And it is not something that government has to deal with all the time, or consider. If government wants to be nimble, what it will do is empower trade unions and engagers to deal with it. At the other end, some of the work that I think people might consider more mundane, that is being automated through AI at the minute, things like radio commercials. We are seeing a growing number of radio commercials that are completely automatically generated from a series of voices. It is unidentifiable whose voice it is, maybe 400 or 500 different voices merged together into a single jingle. Why does that fill our members with terror? It doesn't fill them with terror because they're going to particularly miss radio commercials. It's not the sort of thing that you go into acting to do, by and large. But where it fills them with terror is that is the kind of income that allows them to go and work in a theatre.
Yeah.
And the broader lesson for the economy is this. Are you going to have a worker-centred approach to dealing with AI, and where you actually accept that when there are these boring administrative jobs, repetitive jobs that are automated, that is the income that people need in order to set up their startup, to be an actor, to do anything else? Or are you going to have a worker-centred approach to say, well, hang on a minute, how are we going to make those sectors who are less threatened or who are benefiting from AI pay their fair way back? Actually, how can we rise continuing poverty pay for my people in theatre, in independent TV, in order to make sure that they don't have to rely on that less exciting work that is going to be automated and is readily being automated as we speak.
Yeah, that's a good point. And certainly with my day job hat on, I mean, a lot of our clients rely on, as you say, voiceover, corporate speaking, there's kind of, I guess, the less glamorous end of things, which actually provides them with a steady income. Okay, I think there was a question at the back of the room here.
Thank you. I'm Emily Holtzhausen from Carers UK, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Care and Support Alliance. My colleague is also here, Jackie from MenCap as well. My question is a really good debate around the positives of digital and the future of work. What's been really interesting during this pandemic is that it's really helped, for example, some old workers. You know, what is the future of work for older workers? And we've seen, as you said, caring responsibilities. People have had to juggle work and care. And as social care has not been provided, you know, a lot of the care around this has closed down. What is the future of work, of those sort of structural things that we need? It's not just about flexibility, home working, digitalisation, creation of new jobs or micro jobs. It's actually, you know, if we think back to the world of childcare, for example, nursery places, if we don't have that kind of structural infrastructure, the whole world of flexibility and digital will actually be losing out on a significant part of talent. So I just wondered what your comments were on that. I mean, you've made some good comments about reskilling as well, which is critically important for older workers.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, great question. Thank you. I mean, David, I imagine that a lot of your members are setting up businesses because they want to fit it around other responsibilities in their lives.
Yeah, no, so, I mean, we've got members set up businesses because they couldn't get the kind of part-time flexible arrangements that they wanted, and now everybody in the business works on job shares, for instance. We've got quite a lot of those, and you know, in a way, I would say, I hope that the competitive advantage they get from that would encourage more of those businesses. I think it will encourage more. I suspect the pandemic will do a little bit more than that itself to accelerate some of the, I guess, just basic understanding between employer, employee, both ways round, in terms of how we can better fit work and life together in a way that establishes proper boundaries, proper digital boundaries, but also, you know, enables someone to do something they couldn't do 10 years ago because of the way society treats caring responsibilities. And I hope it will change. I think it probably will. I think we've definitely got a lot of people at the front end of that driving it. A lot of those, to be honest, were doing it before the pandemic, but I think it might have encouraged a lot more to do it since, so
Yeah.
hopefully.
And Jimmy, are many people you're talking to, I imagine they're similarly motivated when they're setting up their businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's quite a lot happening in the childcare space as well, actually. We've had 2 guests on the podcast in the last couple of months that are sort of disrupting childcare, making it more kind of flexible on that side of things. So we have Rachel Carroll from Koru Kids and Ari Last from Bubble, and it's I just find it interesting, and it is quite sort of flexible. You know, I take a day off a week to sort of look after our daughter and so on, but sometimes like we've ended up having to do a podcast recording and so on, like, and we end up doing we end up getting somebody in for 2 hours to kind of do that, and that is like that's completely new in that regard, and I think it's quite exciting, that kind of flexibility of it, to be able to do it. And it's often like young students, or like we've had actors as well kind of do it. So I think it's I think there's a lot of positivity that's happening in that space, and people do want to do more of it. And this is where the great opportunity is, right? It's like, if we don't need people to be in the office all day, every day, it does allow for this kind of flexibility to happen. But what we need is good employers and understanding employers on some of this side of things, which is what we've been talking about.
Mike, what's the union approach?
Yeah, I mean, a very complicated subject. It goes back to, I think, what I said at the beginning about notions of flexibility will vary depending upon the demography of the workforce that you're dealing with. The questioner's point about people at the more mature end, there's got to be opportunity to deliver the genuine greater diversity and longer engagement where people want it through some of the digital techniques we've learnt about and become much more comfortable with in the last 18 months. Notwithstanding how that is going to be regulated in the future, and the impact upon availability of work more generally. But again, that conversation sits in a context of a lot of people, as Jimmy's recognised, who go out, whose job requires them to go out, social care being a very, very clear one. And where I do worry that the whole conversation about working from home means nothing, and understandably means nothing, because they don't have access to it, either because of the structural nature of their work or shift patterns. And we therefore must have this much broader conversation about the notions of flexibility. And with employers who also have operational imperatives to deliver. We've got to get employers of different types into a comfortable position that they know that they're going to have business continuity with flexibility. That's the conundrum. We're an employer of people. We have that conundrum as well to work through. As a trade union, we have staff who need flexibility. We also need to be able to represent members. So we've got that experience. We have to have that conversation in a real way. Then, depending upon the size and the nature of the organisation, small and medium employers, it's much more difficult. Although sometimes, because of the closeness of relationships and the trust at that level and the visibility, there may be some better dynamics. I think one of the problems is that the media presents this often in a binary way, and it's all one way or another, whereas we all know the truth coalesces in the middle. But we will need to think about this in terms of employment status, in terms of the tax system, and crucially building a proposition where in this country people can move into direct employment or self-employment, into retraining, into a caring period against a suitably defined framework. And let's not forget in all this, income in retirement. Our pension system and our income in retirement systems are simply not shaped for this at all. We are seeing the working, I confidently predict in 20 years' time, income in the non-economically active part of your life is going to be an issue because we ain't investing enough now through DC schemes, and obviously defined benefit schemes are working their way through. There needs to be a big conversation about how that is supported if we're going to have a genuinely flexible workforce.
I do think on that, like the sort of definition of it. I mean, look, I come at it from the sort of the entrepreneurial side, but I've often thought like we need like a redefinition of what entrepreneur is, because it's, you know, is it somebody who's self-employed? You know, is it when somebody takes somebody on? But all of the employment status as well, like it's just so dramatically changing, and it's just not binary, and so on. And it's really hard, and people want to dial up and dial down at different points as well. And so it's yeah, I just echo those points. But I do think some like redefining of what we actually mean by these things is quite important.
Yeah, if I just say on that, I think we are using terminology of the last century in a situation where we're having an acceleration of a whole range of trends as a result of an 18-month experience that none of us could have predicted.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, I guess your members are, by definition, or under that definition, quite entrepreneurial because they're working for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that we need to redefine what entrepreneurialism is, or indeed redefine what self-employment is really important, because it's the obsession with bogus self-employment. The obsession with bogus self-employment reigned the government's thinking when it came to the self-employed income support scheme that then excluded 40%, about 47,000 members from a penny. 40% of those 47,000 members, no furlough, no self-employed income support. Why? Because the government was obsessed with getting a scheme that excluded the bogus self-employed. And that actually has hit so many people, disproportionately women, disproportionately carers, in the creative industries. And actually there's this vision of, if you're self-employed, you are, sort of, doing very well for yourself, and you're probably cheating your tax a little bit, and, not really somebody that we need to worry about from an income point of view. Well, the opposite is absolutely true. They are more precarious and in a really, really difficult situation. Now, we have our members being asked for an additional 1% in their national insurance contributions, as everybody else is, but still unable to access the same benefits as somebody who's paying Class 1. How on earth is that fair? And that is a question about retirement, it's a question about pensions. That is also a question about provisions around childcare and other caring responsibilities. And there really does need to be a rethinking and a refocusing on, are we just obsessed with bogus self-employment? And if we want to have this dynamic economy, how do we fix it? I'd say as well, there's a real, one of the most pernicious things that we see in lots of industries is where engagers wish to offer improved terms and conditions to self-employed, perhaps limby workers, as we might call them, around things like childcare. They are constantly advised not to do so because they are terrified that suddenly you're going to end up people being classified as Class 1 NI, the additional burdens and so on that puts on its business. We have a tax and NI system that actively ensures that people want to provide less stuff so that the self-employed can benefit through collective or individual bargaining from things which their employee colleagues benefit from. That is a wrong way to approach a tax system. It's a wrong way to approach a social benefit system, and it's certainly not an entrepreneurial, flexible way to do so either.
Could I just add one thing very quickly, one thing that came out of the whole set of discussions we were all involved in last March and April. And there were some good discussions with Treasury that just didn't, and Tom was involved in there, my colleague there, we just didn't quite get there on the scheme, was that the lack of data. There was a real, and this is built up over different administrations, it's not one laid just at the door of the current administration, but the lack of data, the lack of definition, and the lack of information that you could actually use to deal with this government concern that you were going to reward people who were simply undeserving. We've got to do something about that as well.
Yeah, I would say on that though, I think there is just a fixed view in the Treasury that they don't like self-employed people, that they are undeserving. It is an institutional view. They've got as much data on the, well, if they got their own systems in order, they would have as much data on people who work for themselves as anyone else. So
That's interesting.
I just, the government like politically, the Conservative Party has a real fight if it wants to get the machinery of government to do anything that rewards the self-employed or entrepreneurs or people who start their businesses. And I think there is a bit of a casual treatment at the moment of how, you know, the attitudes that government itself has. There's not enough challenge, I don't think, from Conservative ministers in particular on the advice that they get regarding the self-employed, because it all comes back to this idea that they don't like the self-employed. Obviously no one in the civil services, you know, self-employed, and I think that does create a problem, and I think there is a need for challenge.
That's interesting to hear, given the party, it's supposed to be the party of business and,
Yeah, exactly.
and helping yourself, yeah. Becky, you had a question.
Thank you very much. My name's Becky Wright. I'm the Executive Director of Unions 21. And I wanted to pick up a thread on AI and also of what Paul and Mike have been talking about, the engagement of unions and employers. The first one is that we know actually the majority of jobs that are going to grow over the next 5 years will not be where automation is. In fact, there'll be the jobs where you can't automate.
Yes.
We've yet to create a robot that can look after older people, who can look after children and help them tie their shoelaces. And until that day comes, that's where a lot of the jobs will be. And we don't really have any kind of idea how that's going to operate back in the communities around terms and conditions and about people's experiences and dignity of work. Our colleagues in Sweden and in Denmark would say, why is government getting involved in these collective agreements and the relationship between the employers and the unions? More often than not, we come up with better solutions together than when we have legislation that we've got to go through hoops with. And a couple of weeks ago, I was on a call with a colleague from the the Danish Finance Union, who have been instrumental actually in creating the fintech sector in Denmark. And their take was, well, you know, we go to employers now who sign up to a sectoral collective agreement and say, you're great at your fintech stuff. I mean, I can't begin to understand exactly what that means. I'm hoping the panel might. But you're not great yet at employing people because you've not got that experience. So just go along with the collective agreement and you'll find yourselves in a lot less trouble. We often talk about the decline of unions, but we don't talk about the decline of employers' organisations and the dismantling of that particular structure. And so I'd be really keen to hear the views of the panel about that and kind of what can happen to encourage the resurgence of, the, collective bargaining mechanism or the relationship between employers and unions.
Sure, Mike?
Well, I've had, forgive me, this may be a slightly controversial moment, in the sense that I've had my moments shouting at the television. It's not an unusual thing for me, but in the last few weeks, and that has been around the driver shortage. And some of it has got more recent antecedents. Let's not go into those, but the thing which has contributed, I think, significantly, we don't represent in this area, but other unions do, and was decades-long dismantling of national collective bargaining in road haulage, and also the contribution from making a number of drivers self-employed. And if you look at the definitions of self-employed in the tax and employment system, and the extent to which individuals can substitute themselves for other individuals, which is a usual way of defining self-employment, difficult to see how it operates there. So some of the things we've been doing in this country, and this is where a very straightforward trade union point, we have dismantled the spaces in which we bargained nationally, where we set sectoral standards, where actually employers came together, and these are things that happen in other economies. And in other economies, employers who behave differently here behave differently there. And they are prepared to sit together. Sometimes it can be uncomfortable for some of the trade unions, but nonetheless it works because you then set a floor, you set a structure, and you can usually also create some form of standards around training and delivery. So we will have to explore some of these things again, and You know, when government does talk about that high wage, high skill economy, some of it will be delivered on entrepreneurialism and business acumen. In fact, a great deal of it will, but some of it also needs some structure and regulation.
And Paul?
I mean, it's perhaps an odd thing to say again in this space, but you know, one of the Labour Party's commitment to rebuilding, which was reaffirmed last week, reaffirming rebuilding those structures of collective bargaining across the economy. One of the biggest debates that was had in 2019 when they were consulting with the unions was our concern that employers did not have the mechanisms or the expertise to engage with them. So I think Becky's absolutely right that it is an enormous gap on the engagers side because there is a cultural reluctance to collectively bargain because it's perceived as something that simply it is not. And actually, if you look at our member, why do so many small-scale theatres use union collective agreements? Well, they use union collective agreements because it's one or two people operating out of a bedroom and they have an entire framework that they know is fair and equal, just that the engagers have had a say in, but not necessarily them directly. That sectoral collective bargaining is critical to an increasingly fractured economy. Now, I mean, there is it would be a classic conservative instinct to dismantle the red tape that prevents this from happening, to compel engagers, to compel employers into that sectoral collective bargaining and create those floors. And I think conversations around Uber and those sort of gig economy phenomena are showing that essentially what the working people within them really want is a framework, and government doesn't have to deliver that; they need to deliver the empowerment to make sure it can happen.
Yeah, Jimmy, anything on that?
These gentlemen know far more about it on it, so I won't go.
Fair enough, David.
Yeah, I think you've covered it.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to wrap up there, but I am going to, we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask the panel to let our audience know what is their one key takeaway. What's the one thing that the audience should take away from this discussion? Jimmy?
Oh, it's hard to come to me, but overwhelmingly, I think it's to be positive about what is being created, and probably the modern renaissance point from me.
Yeah. Mike?
Government can't opt out. It's either a supplier of last resort or it needs to be a convener of solutions.
Excellent. David?
Just as this is Conservative Party conference, I think Conservative ministers just need to be wary of being too complacent. They've been in power a long time and things are changing very quickly in the economy, and unless they challenge, things will not get better as they should.
Paul?
I suppose what the future of work looks like, there are very few choices around, but there are massive choices as to how fair that future is for both workers and engagers. And it's important to focus on the choices rather than the inevitabilities.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, I think all those 4 points taken together could lead to a very bright future indeed. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Becky and Unions 21 for partnering with us on this event, and thank you to our panellists and to our audience in person and to all of you online. Do my little sales bit. You can join Bright Blue at the bargain price of £10 for during conference only. I think it's only about £20 anyway, but please do join up, and then you'll get invited to lots of our different events and things that we do. We have 27 events running all together throughout this conference. The next one up is on the transition to net zero at 1 o'clock right here. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, and a big round of applause for our panel.